In the frozen winter of 1933, the knock could come at any hour. A man in Ohio kept 20 gold double eagles in a coffee tin behind the flour. A widow in Baltimore had 3 coins sewn into a mattress, one for each grandchild. For 150 years, holding gold had been the most ordinary act of an American saver, the surest way to keep faith with a dollar that had always, by law, been convertible to metal. Then, in a single season, that faith became a suspicion, and the saver became a suspect in the eyes of his own government. This is the story of how Washington outlawed a metal, not confiscated a shipment, not taxed a fortune, outlawed the substance itself, in coin, in bar, in the paper certificates that promised it. The government set a single price, $20.67 an ounce, and told a nation of savers to bring their gold to the window and take paper in exchange. Millions did. They lined up at bank counters from Portland to Savannah and surrendered wedding coins and inheritance, and the small, hard weight of a lifetime's caution. And here is the part that turns a bank policy into a story worth telling. Once the gold was gathered, once it sat safely in the Treasury's hands rather than the public's, the same government that had fixed the price at $20.67 reached back and changed it. Overnight, gold was worth $35 an ounce. The citizens who had obeyed held paper. The state held the metal, and the difference. It was legal. It was deliberate. And it made the United States Treasury billions. To understand how a free country reached the point of criminalizing a coin, you have to go back to the months before that first knock, to the vaults that were emptying, the banks that were failing, and the panic that was pulling gold out of America faster than the nation could hold it. The confiscation did not begin with an order, it began with a run. By the winter of 1932 into 1933, the machinery of American money was seizing. The Great Depression was 3 years deep. 9,000 banks had failed since the crash of 1929, taking the savings of ordinary depositors down with them. Every failure taught the next depositor the same lesson: get out, and get out in gold. Paper dollars could evaporate when a bank closed its doors. Gold coins in a mattress could not. So the hoarding began, and then it accelerated into a run. Depositors withdrew currency and demanded it in metal. Foreign holders of dollars, watching America wobble, cashed their claims and shipped the gold abroad. The Federal Reserve, which by law had to back its notes with gold, watched its vaults drain week after week. In February 1933 alone, the outflow turned to hemorrhage. The Fed's gold reserves fell toward the legal minimum below which the whole currency would fail. A nation was, quite literally, running out of gold. State by state, governors tried to stop the bleeding by shutting the banks. Michigan closed its banks on February 14th. The panic spread like fever. Maryland, then Ohio, then Illinois, and New York. By the morning of March 4th, 1933, the day Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in on the Capitol steps, banking had halted in 32 states. The new president told the crowd the only thing they had to fear was fear itself, while behind him the actual vault stood locked and nearly empty. He did not wait. On March 6th, 2 days into his term, Roosevelt invoked the Wartime Trading with the Enemy Act and declared a national bank holiday. Every bank in the country closed. For 4 days, no American could withdraw a dollar or a coin. It bought Washington time. Time to reopen the sound banks, and time to sever the country from its oldest financial habit. The bank holiday stopped the run. But stopping the run was not enough. To keep the gold from leaving again, the government would have to take it. And 1 month later, it did exactly that. On April 5, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102 and with a single signature made it illegal for an American to own gold. Not to sell it, not to export it, to own it. The order was titled with bureaucratic calm, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates. The word hoarding did the work. a lifetime of prudent saving was rebranded as a crime against the recovery. The terms were exact and unforgiving. Every person in the United States was required to deliver their gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank or member bank. The deadline was May 1st, 1933, 26 days. In return, the citizen received paper currency at the going legal rate, $20.67 per ounce of fine gold. Fair on its face. $1 of gold for $1 of paper. The penalty for refusal was severe enough to make the choice for most people. Anyone who kept their gold in violation of the order faced a fine of up to $10,000, a fortune in 1933, several years, wages for a working family, or up to 10 years in federal prison, or both. The government was not asking, it was commanding, with the full weight of criminal law behind the demand. There were narrow exceptions, and they mattered. Citizens could keep up to $100 in gold coin, about 5 double eagles. Dentists, jewelers, and industries that genuinely used gold could hold what their trade required. And collectors could keep gold coins having a recognized special value to collectors of rare and unusual coins, a phrase that would send people digging for loopholes for decades. But for the ordinary saver with a tin of coins, there was no exception at all. Only the window, the paper, and the deadline. The order set the machinery in motion. Now the government had to see whether a nation of savers would actually obey, whether Americans would carry their gold to the bank and hand it across the counter. In the last weeks of April, they answered. They obeyed. That is the quiet astonishment at the center of this story. In the last weeks of April 1933, Americans formed lines at bank counters across the country and handed over their gold. In New York and Chicago, the Federal Reserve banks took in metal by the ton. People brought coffee tins and cigar boxes and handkerchiefs knotted around double eagles. They surrendered wedding coins, christening gifts, the gold pieces a father had pressed into a son's hand. Across the counter went the metal. Back came paper dollars at $20.67 an ounce. The compliance was overwhelming, but not total. By the deadline, the Treasury had gathered enormous quantities of coin and bullion, hundreds of millions of dollars, worth flowing into federal vaults. Yet a stubborn remainder never came. Some Americans simply refused. They buried their coins in gardens, sealed them into walls, or carried them across the border to banks in Canada and safe deposit boxes in Switzerland, beyond the reach of the order. Gold is small, dense, and silent, the easiest wealth in the world to hide. Prosecutions were rare, and that itself became part of the record. The government made an example of a few. In one widely noted case, a New York attorney named Frederick Barber Campbell had deposited over 5,000 ounces at Chase and was indicted when he tried to withdraw his own gold. The threat of 10 years and $10,000 hung over everyone, but the state mostly relied on the far cheaper force of civic obedience, and it worked. The exemptions became the seams where gold survived in the open. Jewelers kept their stock, dentists kept their casting gold. Collectors invoked the rare and unusual clause, and a generation of numismatists learned to describe every coin as a collectible. Through those narrow, watched loopholes, a thread of private gold stayed legal. But the order was an emergency measure, signed under wartime powers, and emergencies end. To make the taking permanent, to turn a seizure into settled law, Washington needed an act of Congress. That act was already being drafted. Executive Order 6102 had gathered the gold, but it stood on borrowed legal ground. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a wartime statute stretched to cover a peacetime panic. An emergency order could be challenged, narrowed, or simply allowed to lapse. To make the transfer permanent, Washington turned from the president's pen to the machinery of Congress. The result was the Gold Reserve Act, signed into law on January 30th, 1934. The act did something quiet and enormous. It moved the nation's gold out of the Federal Reserve, the network of regional banks that had held the metal as backing for its notes, and placed it in the direct ownership of the United States Treasury. From that day, the gold belonged to the government itself. The Federal Reserve was compensated with gold certificates it could no longer redeem for actual metal. The physical gold, all of it, was now the property of the state. This was the legal keystone. What Executive Order 6102 had begun as an emergency seizure, the Gold Reserve Act finished as settled federal law. The coins from the coffee tins, the bullion from the bank vaults, the gathered weight of a nation's private saving. It was no longer held in trust or under a temporary order. It was owned, by statute, by the Treasury of the United States, and Congress had said so. And the act did one thing more, the thing that turns this from a story of confiscation into a story of profit. It gave the president the power to set a new value for gold, to fix the dollar's worth in metal at a level of his choosing. The old price, the one every citizen had been paid at the window, was $20.67 an ounce. The act cleared the way to change it. The gold was gathered, the law was written, the Treasury owned the metal, and the president held the authority to reprice it at will. Everything was in place for a single stroke of the pen, the maneuver, one day later, that would make the whole seizure pay. On January 31, 1934, one day after the Gold Reserve Act became law, Franklin Roosevelt reached for a pen and changed a number that had held steady for a century. Gold, fixed at $20.67 an ounce since 1834, was revalued to $35. Nothing physical moved. No metal was mined, melted, or shipped. A president simply declared that the same ounce now bought more dollars, and in that single sentence, the value of every dollar in America fell by roughly 40% overnight. For the Treasury, the arithmetic was a windfall. It already held the nation's gold. The coins, the bullion, the certificates surrendered at $20.67 under Executive Order 6102. Now every ounce in the vaults was worth $35 on the government's own books. The gap between the old price and the new was pure paper profit, and it was enormous. Roughly $2.8 billion, conjured by revaluation alone, without a single new asset entering the country. Where did it go? $2 billion of that windfall was carved off and poured into a new instrument called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a pool of money the Treasury could deploy to steady the dollar, buy and sell currencies, and intervene in markets without asking Congress. The remaining profit padded the government's balance sheet. The citizen who had handed over a gold coin in April 1933 received $20.67. 9 months later, that same coin was booked at $35, and the difference belonged not to him, but to Washington. This was the maneuver the whole confiscation had made possible. First, the metal was gathered at a fixed, low price. Then the price was moved. The people who owned the gold absorbed the loss. The government that took it collected the gain. It was legal, deliberate, and staggeringly profitable, a transfer of wealth executed with a signature. But a maneuver this large could not go unchallenged. Across the country, bondholders who had been promised payment in gold were about to discover their contracts rewritten. They would take the United States government to court, and the fight would climb all the way to the Supreme Court. The promise was written in ink on millions of contracts. Gold clauses, provisions that guaranteed repayment in gold coin of a fixed weight and fineness, had been standard in American bonds for decades. They existed precisely to protect lenders against a government that might one day debase its currency. In 1933 and 1934, that is exactly what the government did. When Congress revalued gold and voided those clauses by joint resolution in June 1933, it told every creditor in the country that a debt promised in gold would now be settled in paper dollars, dollars worth far less than the metal they had been pledged. Bondholders who had lent in good faith found their contracts rewritten by legislative fiat. They sued. By early 1935, 4 cases had climbed to the Supreme Court, argued together as the Gold Clause cases. The stakes were almost impossible to overstate. One plaintiff held a $10,000 Liberty bond whose gold clause, if honored, would have entitled him to roughly $16,900 in the new devalued dollars. Multiplied across the nation's public and private debt, honoring the clauses could have cost the government and corporate America tens of billions, a sum that threatened to unravel the entire recovery. The justices understood that a ruling for the bondholders could bankrupt the country as surely as the Depression had. On February 18, 1935, the court delivered its answer. By a vote of 5-4, with Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes writing for the majority, it held that Congress had the constitutional power to regulate the currency and could void the gold clauses in private contracts. Justice James McReynolds, reading his dissent from the bench, departed from his written text to declare that the Constitution is gone, but the majority had spoken. The promises were extinguished. With that decision, the confiscation was sealed as constitutional law. The gold had been taken, revalued, and its contractual claims erased, all upheld by the highest court in the land. Now the government needed a place to keep what it had gathered, and it was already pouring concrete in the hills of Kentucky. The metal needed a fortress. Gathered from banks and pockets across a continent, the nation's gold could not sit scattered in Federal Reserve branches. It needed one place hardened against theft, fire, and war. In 1936, on a military reservation south of Louisville, the Treasury completed the United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky. It was built like nothing else in America. The structure rose from granite lined with steel and concrete, its two-story vault set at the core. The vault door alone weighed more than 20 tons. Its casing and the surrounding walls ran 22 inches thick, layered steel and concrete engineered so that no single person could ever open it. Entry required several staff members, each knowing only part of the combination, a lock split among many, so it could be worked by no one alone. Guard boxes, machine gun positions, and a garrison of soldiers ringed the grounds. In January 1937, the filling began. Guarded trains rolled south from the assay offices and mints of New York and Philadelphia, carrying gold under armed escort along a route the Army and the Postal Service protected foot by foot. Bar by bar, the bullion was stacked inside, each standard bar weighing about 400 troy ounces, roughly 27 pounds of gold. By the time the transfers slowed, Fort Knox held thousands of tons, at its peak more than 20,000 tons, the largest concentration of gold ever assembled in one place. The symbolism was total. Gold that had once jingled in coin purses, filled Christmas stockings, and backed the promises of ordinary savers now lay in numbered bars, behind a door no citizen would ever pass. It was no longer money in circulation. It was property of the state, inventory held for the government's account, seen by almost no one and owned by everyone and no one at once. The taking was complete, ordered by decree, finished by statute, upheld by the court, and now locked in Kentucky steel. But the law that made it possible would outlive Roosevelt himself, casting its shadow across 4 more decades of American money. For 41 years, it stayed illegal for an American to own the metal his grandparents had kept in a drawer. The ban, written into Executive Order 6102 and hardened by the Gold Reserve Act, outlived the Depression, outlived the New Deal, outlived Roosevelt, who died in 1945. Through the Second World War and the long boom that followed, gold remained a thing citizens could look at in museums, but not hold. The system it built abroad was called Bretton Woods. In 1944, with the dollar fixed to gold at $35 an ounce, the world's currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the United States promised foreign governments they could redeem their dollars for American gold. For a quarter century it held. But as dollars flooded overseas and the gold in Fort Knox could no longer cover the claims against it, the promise strained. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window. In a televised address, he suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold, cutting the last formal link between American money and the metal. The $35 peg, the very price the revaluation had created in 1934, was finished. Within 2 years, the dollar floated free, and gold's price was set by markets alone, climbing far past anything the Treasury had ever fixed. Only then did the ban itself fall. On August 14, 1974, President Gerald Ford signed a law restoring the right, and on December 31, 1974, Americans could once again legally own gold, coins, bars, and bullion for the first time since May 1, 1933. 41 years of silence ended with a quiet change in the law. But the profit was already banked, the wealth already transferred, the precedent already set. A government had declared a metal contraband, bought it low from its own people, revalued it high for itself, erased the promises it had made, and locked the proceeds behind 22-inch steel. It was legal from first order to last, and it began with a single, staggering act that no one who lived through it ever forgot. They made owning gold a crime.